Hi, everyone. This is a overview of the midterm study guide. I hope that it helps explain any questions that you might have had. And of course, you can always email me a question if you don't understand something that I say here. So starting with question 1, and you will notice that I only gave you 3 questions. I did not give you a question. I was trying to make it a little big there. There we go. I didn't make a question, give you a question based on chapter 6. So there are only 3 questions, 7, 11, and 9. So start with the first one, is chapter 9, and that's the chapter that's focused on global stratification and social stratification. So I focus particularly on social stratification in the United States in this question. I ask you here to define social stratification and explain how open and closed systems of stratification work. Okay, so define social stratification, maybe give an example of what that is in the United States, and then the closed and the open systems, explain those, give an example for that first part. Then I tell you to discuss the functionalist, conflict, and symbolic interactionist perspectives on social stratification. And remember, always give an example or two in your discussion. So you can say, well, functionalist theorists view social stratification as, and then, for example, and then that supports the statement that you made. It's always important to support the statement that you make. So in the textbook, those 3 perspectives are discussed. Then I ask you to explain the difference between absolute and relative poverty. 2 different measures of poverty. The US uses one type of measure and other countries use another type of measure. And so I'm asking you, tell me what these 2 different measures are. How do they work? And then I ask you, which poverty measure does the US use? I also ask you, do you believe that this is the appropriate measure to use? There are some people who argue we should use a different measure. That's discussed in the text. Think about whether or not you agree with that. Finally, do you think American society is a meritocracy? Meritocracy is discussed in the text. Meritocracy is the idea that everyone gets what they deserve, that all you have to do is work hard, do what you're supposed to, obey laws, go to school, network, work hard for promotions, etc., and that you will be successful. I ask you, do you think that's really true? Maybe you do, maybe you don't. Again, support your opinion with at least 2 examples. So that's question number 2. Question number 1 based on chapter 9. The next question is based on chapter 11, and chapter 11 focuses on racial and ethnic stratification and relationships in the US. So first, explain prejudice and discrimination. There are 2 different things. Prejudice is how we think and how we feel about people who are different from ourselves. And discrimination, of course, is action. It's acting on the prejudices that we have. So explain these, give examples. So at least one example of prejudice, one example of discrimination, of how we're still seeing these 2 things in the US today. Discuss how the functionalist, conflict, and symbolic interactionist perspectives view racial and ethnic stratification. Again, this is discussed in some detail in the text, so make sure you refer to that as you're studying. And then I ask you to choose 2 of the groups discussed in section 11.5 in the textbook and summarize at least 3 critical parts of the history in the US and the status of these 2 groups today. So there are, I think, 4 or 5 different groups that are discussed in the chapter. Choose 2 of them. Summarize 3 critical parts of their history in the United States, and then what's the status of each of those 2 groups today. Okay, that's chapter 11. And finally, the chapter 7 question, the last one, I ask you to define deviance and explain why it is sometimes difficult for people to agree about what constitutes deviance. So remember that in the text, there's a discussion about why it's difficult to nail down a discussion about deviance. Like, not everybody agrees on what is deviant. Crime is easy to define, anything that violates a law. But deviance, as the textbook discusses, is more difficult to get people to agree. For example, I live in a state, Nevada, where prostitution's legal, as I think it should be. but most states do not allow prostitution. It's considered immoral, it's bad, right, shameful, etc. And so while I don't think that prostitution is deviant behavior, a lot of people do. So that's just one example of why it is sometimes difficult to pin down deviant behavior. Now, of course, most people would say, yeah, murder's wrong. Some things are a little easier to define as deviant behavior, but not everything. Also, I ask you to explain in detail the three perspectives on deviance: functionalist, conflict, symbolic, interactionist, again discussed in the textbook in a lot of detail, and discuss one theory or concept for each perspective. So in the discussion, there are at least a couple of theories that are discussed for functionalist and for symbolic interactionism, and for conflict perspective, there's a discussion about Marx's work upon which it is based. So one for each of those three. And then, do you believe social class and race affect how well a defendant is represented in a criminal case? Support your answer with at least 2 examples. So that's just your opinion. You live in the United States, you see, you read, you hear about different criminal cases, and so what do you think? Is there some advantage for some people, depending upon social class or race, and a disadvantage for others? That's it. Study and be prepared. You get 2 attempts for this one, so if you log in and you start working on it and you think, okay, no, I'm not as ready as I thought I was, you can log out. You'll have another attempt to come back in. You probably won't get the same 2 questions, but since there are only 3, you'll probably get at least one that's the same. Okay?